Alright, there is this guy in high school named Clyde. Pretty much everyone kept their distance from him except for his two friends, who were equally gross. In my junior year, I had the misfortune of being assigned to a seat right next to him in one of my classes. I immediately planned to ask the teacher to move my seat at the end of the class period on the first day. Before I could even get a chance, Clyde was already starting to annoy me. He kept asking me all these questions about where I got my bag, my shoes, my top, and if my hair color was natural or dyed. All these questions coming from a person whose ass I could smell from 3 feet away. I made it through the first class period and I stayed after to talk to the teacher, but she totally stonewalled me. She was one of those teachers who never really made expectations for anyone or anything. I had been warned about her by some seniors before. I thought she would let it slide instead of making a girl sit next to the weirdest known creep in the school for the whole year. But no. It only took a couple of days for Clyde to develop a crush on me. To make matters worse, I was still walking to and home from school. Clyde found out about this and he took the opportunity to follow me home one day. Or as he put it, escort me home. To make sure I was safe as if I hadn't been able to take care of myself for the last 2 years. My house was a 15-minute walk from the school. It was usually a perfect amount of time and went through a good area. Time to relax between responsibilities and clear my head. Clyde took this and made it feel like eternal hell. We were out in the open, so everybody in the school was able to see us. Most people knew about what was going on, but some people actually thought I wanted to hang out with him. When I knew I had to sit next to him permanently, I tried to be as nice as I could, which wasn't very nice, but even that had been too much. It was too late to be mean because I tried that too, and it didn't work. He found a way to gush about everything I said and did. He kept comparing us and arguing that we were very similar somehow. He was obsessed with the idea that we could get together and be like Bonnie and Clyde, but my name isn't even close to Bonnie. The worst part of him walking with me was the fact that he knew where I lived. It's not a surprise that he tried to invite himself in, but I drew a hard line there and almost spit in his face. The only reason I didn't is because he probably would have really enjoyed that. I tried talking to my counselor about this to see if I could change classes, but he was also unhelpful. He would say things like, "Clyde hasn't done anything wrong," which was pretty much useless for me. At the beginning of September, we had a 3-day weekend for Labor Day. I rebelled in having an extra day away from Clyde, but I was fully aware that he was responsible for the fact that I hadn't been able to reconnect with any of my friends from school. This meant that I had no plans for the weekend. I was so depressed that all I wanted to do was lay in bed. I only had one thing going on, which was a baby shower on Saturday for a relative I barely knew. The night before, I had terrible sleep. I kept getting rushes of anxiety for seemingly no reason, and every time I started to fall asleep, I fell straight into a nightmare about Clyde. At one point, I woke up and I even thought I saw his face in the window. I had a mini heart attack, but when I blinked, he was gone. Just to be sure, I got up and I looked outside, but there was no sign of him in the backyard. I closed my blinds and I even put down the blackout curtains I never use. I couldn't sleep at all after that. I really couldn't decide if what I saw was real or just a visual disturbance. Sometimes when I'm just waking up, I see a crystal clear vision of a giant spider descending toward me on a thread, but when I blink, it goes away before my body even wakes up enough to move. In the morning, I asked my parents to make extra sure that we locked up the house before we left for the baby shower. I told them about the situation with Clyde and how he had been following me around. At least they had a concern for me, thankfully. My dad assured me that he would lock the house, and my mother went the extra mile to remind me that she was a good shot with a taser. Then she gave me the little bottle of pepper spray from her keychain. It made me feel a little bit better, but I was still out of it the whole day. My relatives kept asking me if I was okay, and all I could say was yes. He didn't get home until about 8 o'clock that night. I had a snack in the kitchen, and while I was there, I made sure that the back door was still locked. Afterward, I went straight to my room and I watched YouTube videos on my laptop until I passed out. Sometime later I woke up, but I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe either. I was gripped with sleep paralysis. The closest thing I have had to a sleep paralysis demon is the dangling spider I had mentioned earlier, but there was no sign of a spider. I kept trying to force myself to take a breath, but it was like I had forgotten how to do it. I tried to relax instead, and I looked around my room, but I got creeped out because it was darker than usual due to the curtains. Of course, I could clearly see Clyde's face peeking over the edge of my bed. My heart nearly jumped out of my chest, but I still couldn't move. I kept staring at his face, waiting for it to go away, praying for it to be a hallucination. But when I blinked, he didn't go away. He moved. Clyde slowly stood up and hovered over me. "Let's have a sleepover," he whispered, as he approached my mouth with a strip of duct tape. At the last second, I broke free from the grip of sleep paralysis and screamed as I grabbed the pillow next to me and stuffed it into his face. He blindly stuck the piece of tape over my mouth, but while he couldn't see what was going on, I quickly reached underneath the pillow I was sleeping on and grabbed the pepper spray my mother gave me and undid the safety like she explained. Then I pointed it right at his face at the exact moment he ripped the pillow away. I fired the spray and it nailed him as well as it possibly could, but some of it backfired and got on me. We were both incapacitated, but luckily, it only took another 15 seconds for my parents to come running into my room, at which point, they conducted a citizen's arrest until the police arrived. The cops did a sweep of the house and found damage to the outside of the lock on the back door, which indicated Clyde had picked the lock. It truly doesn't surprise me at all that lockpicking is something he is good at. Clyde went to a juvenile detention center for a couple of weeks. Then, through an annoying bureaucratic process, I managed to get him expelled from school. I was once in a relationship with the craziest girl I've ever met. I was pretty desperate for love when I thought I fell for her. She might have been the hottest girl I'll ever be with, but she was so not worth it. I realized that she was extremely unhealthy for me. She spent all my money and ran off all my friends, and once she had me to myself, she used up all my free time and drained my life force. That's not even going into the slightest detail about all the little things that make her craziness her own kind of special crazy. I finally couldn't do it anymore, and I broke it off as humanly as I possibly could. I did it in person, in a private setting, in my car right in front of her apartment. She cried, screamed, and slapped me in my face. She even threw some things around and made a huge mess in my car. But no matter what she said, I told her there was no chance I would take her back. She stormed off, and the last thing she said to me before she slammed the car door was that I would regret ever doing her wrong. In reality, I actually regret ever fooling myself into thinking it was a good idea to get into bed with her in the first place. Once I drove off, I felt a wave of relief. It felt like I had been freed from the spell of an evil witch. I spent the rest of the day doing all the things I never got to do when she was around. Then I hit up my friends and went to the bar with them for the first time in a month. I told them about how it went down, and they warned me about something. Just like they warned me about the dangers of crazy girls when I first got with her. "This is not over," they said. "You might be done with her, but she's not done with you." They could not have been more correct. That very night, when my buddies and I left the bar, I went to my car and noticed something in the trough between the hood and the windshield. I took a closer look and I pulled out a crooked and rusted 6-inch steel nail. I keep my car very clean, so I was pretty sure it hadn't been there in the morning. I don't know anything about witchcraft or magic, and I don't believe any of it. But my ex-girlfriend was a proudly self-proclaimed witch, so I had a suspicion it had something to do with her. I asked one of my friends to ask his girlfriend about it, and she confirmed what I thought, explaining that my ex probably used it in some kind of spell to hex me, and then left it with me to make sure it did the harm it was supposed to. What a bunch of BS, I thought, but I was still concerned about what else the woman might do. After I found out it was definitely from my ex, I chucked it into the trash. Unfortunately, this was only just the beginning. Over the course of the next week, I went through an ordeal, much of which is probably familiar to many. One morning, I woke up and saw a bunch of key marks on my car. Apparently, they were runes. The next day, 3 of the tires were slashed. 24 hours after that, there was a bunch of broken glass and rusty nails on my doorstep, surrounded by a dark stain on the concrete. My friend's girlfriend said it was probably a vial of war water. What? I don't even know what that means, and quite frankly, I didn't really care. At a certain point, I even started to see her out of the corner of my eye. Just glimpses, though. When I actually turned to look at her, she would be gone, around the corner or behind something, and too far away for me to do anything about it. I was just as annoyed as I was scared. I didn't know what she was capable of, but her intentions were clearly not good. 6 days after we broke up, there was a psychotic note on my door impaled with, you guessed it, a long, rusty nail. It basically said that if I don't want to suffer the greatest agonies imaginable in this life and even greater suffering in the afterlife, I have to immediately go to her apartment and grovel at her feet. Beg, plead, ask for forgiveness, and swear that I'll become completely subservient to her. Oh yeah, real crazy stuff. To hell with that. I didn't do anything, obviously. I had work the next day. I was done letting my life revolve around that immature idiot. I just got my car back from the shop after getting new tires, and since she already targeted my car before, I figured she would do something else to it. I was right, but that wasn't all. When I walked back to my car at the end of my shift, my heart sank. I could see it from 100 feet away, another damn crooked rusty 6-inch nail. But this time, she drove it through my windshield, causing the whole thing to crack into a million pieces. Thankfully, the laminated layer held it all together, but it was totally impossible to see through it. I pulled out my phone and sat down in my car to call another tow truck. But the second I closed the door, I smelled it. My ex's perfume. It was strong too. A chill ran down my spine at that exact moment. I instinctively knew she was right behind me. I looked in my rearview mirror and I saw her crawling out from the floorboard of the back seat. She had the look of pure evil on her face. While smiling, she wrapped her arms around my seat in a weird kind of hug from behind. Then I realized she was holding one of those rusty 6-inch nails in her hands. The point was directed at my heart, and from the shine at the tip, it had clearly been sharpened. She was ready to plunge it into my heart. I laughed. "You're not strong enough to stab that through my sternum," I said. "Shut up," she screamed. "I'm strong enough to stab it through your windshield, wasn't I? What if I jam it through one of your ribs? Or why don't I just shove it down your throat? Huh? How about that? You smart ass." She brought the point of the nail to my jugular, though in the moment I did not care in the slightest. I was suddenly overcome with anger. My patience was gone. All I saw was red. I grabbed my keys and turned on my car. "What are you doing?" shouted my ex. "Don't go anywhere, or I'll stick you with this." She stuck the nail into my flesh and drew blood, but I barely felt it. I switched into first gear and I floored it. The nail cut the side of my neck as my ex flew backwards into the seat. She started screaming bloody murder and trying to regain her footing so she could come get at me, but I was already in second gear, racing through the lanes of the parking lot, struggling to see where I was going through the broken windshield. Once she was climbing over the center console, I slammed on the brakes. Suddenly, I noticed the crazy amount of pain that was in my neck. But she finally got what she deserved and flew straight into the windshield. The lamination still didn't give out and caught her like a net, keeping her inside. I pulled the parking brake, stepped out, then dragged the squealing maniac out of my car and threw her onto the asphalt. I sat back down in my car and locked the doors, then called the police. While they were on their way, my ex banged on the door and tried to force her way into my car. "Look what you did to me," she wailed, pointing at her face. There was a deep gash on the right side of her face, all the way from above her right eyebrow to the corner of her lip. When the police came, they arrested me and took her to the hospital. She pressed charges on me and we almost went to court. But at the last second, the case was dismissed thanks to my lawyers who brought to the attention of the judge all the stalking she had been doing. In the end, my actions were ruled as self-defense. Things still aren't over for me, unfortunately. She's found a new way of ruining my life. I'm being sued in civil court now, but I think in the end, my counter lawsuit will win out. It just goes to show that you should avoid making impulsive decisions. Don't date crazy people, and I guess even if you have a sharp object being held against your throat, you should try to defend yourself as gently as possible. When I was in college and lived in the dorms, I did most of my studying either in the library or the Starbucks on campus. The library was free to get into and quieter, but the Starbucks was closer to most of my classes and had coffee. Plus, I could hang out with my friends at the same time. It was a popular place for that reason and my preferred study spot as well. I had a routine of going there after class and immediately getting everything done so I could have my evenings free. I never paid attention to what was going on around me or who was sitting in the coffee shop. My ability to focus was pretty strong, especially with the help of caffeine and my ADHD medication. My friends weren't quite the same, however. They were much chattier and liked to people watch during their breaks. At the start of the second semester, a new person showed up at the coffee shop. If nobody had told me about him, I would have assumed he had been around all year like anybody else. But my friends knew they had never seen this guy. He seemed harmless at first, just like anybody else. And he was more of a new potential piece of gossip than any sort of threat. When he was pointed out to me, all I saw was another guy with a latte working on his laptop and taking notes while listening to music. My friends asked me what I thought about him, like if he was cute or if I knew who he was. He was kind of pale and a little greasy and had a weak chin. But overall, he was unassuming. "He's a stranger," I said, "and kind of an ugly one." Perhaps I said it too loud because the noise and the laughter of my friends made him glance over at us for just a second. I looked away and got back to work. The next day, he was there at the coffee shop again, doing the exact thing he was doing the day before, writing things down in his notebook, staring at his laptop, and occasionally looking around. I didn't think anything of it. Even when I saw him every day I went there the entire next week. The only thing that struck me as strange was the fact that I was taking notice of it. I'm sure I saw the same 50 faces in there every single time, but I never even registered their existence. What was it about this guy that made me subconsciously pay attention to him? I had no idea. But then again, I had bigger things to deal with. I had notes to take, lectures to listen to, and textbooks to read. I had one class week that was right next to the library. So naturally afterward I would do my studying there, instead of going across campus to go to Starbucks. It was nice to get a break. Peace and quiet was always nice. Nobody talks in the library. Everybody was in their own little world. Not even people watching was a thing. Everyone had their faces down and noses to the grindstone. Everyone except for that one guy. About 10 minutes into my study session, I noticed him sit down about 10 tables away. I rolled my eyes and tried to ignore him, but he kept looking at me. Not glancing, but staring for a few seconds and then looking down once I saw. At this point, it seemed like he may have been developing a crush on me. But I was determined to not let any boys distract me from my goals. After a few more days, he faded into the background. The novelty wore off, and I no longer cared if he was around me or not. Unfortunately, as much as I tried to ignore him, the more he appeared everywhere I went. Even on my way back to my dorm after the 6 o'clock class that had ended at 8 p.m. I was just trying to get home after a long day of class. I walked out the door of the building and nobody was behind me except for the other students in the class that just ended, which I knew did not contain any pale, greasy men with weak chins. And yet, once I made it down the steps and onto the sidewalk, there he was, just standing there. That's when my stomach dropped. I kept on going as I wanted to avoid interaction. Eventually, I found myself alone with him following me. I made it inside my dorm hall and headed to my door, which was on the first floor. I was terrified that this creep would scan his ID and follow me inside. But when I got to my dorm, I glanced back at him. He was just standing in front of the glass and staring at me. I quickly got inside my dorm and locked the door behind me. Unfortunately, my roommate wasn't there to calm my nerves. Claustrophobia started to set in for me, so I turned on some music and tried to study before bed. But I couldn't focus. It took me 3 hours to finish what should have only taken me 1. Finally, at 11 o'clock, I was finally finished. I fell asleep absolutely exhausted. I didn't even stir when my roommate came home. I had some strange nightmares, however, but I don't remember them much. All I know is I woke up in a cold sweat, but when I got up out of bed, I realized something so disturbing that it changed the way I live many aspects of my life. There was a piece of paper stuck to my stomach by my sweat, and when I stood up, it fell to the floor. I picked it up and read it. There were only 6 words written on it. "You are a victim, an ugly one." My heart sank to the floor. My roommate asked me what was wrong, and I begged her to tell me if she locked the door when she came home from the party she went to last night. But she just shrugged. When we checked, we found that she had left it unlocked when she stumbled in. That could potentially mean that the door was wide open for that weirdo to sneak into our room, and for what? Just to scare me? Gradually, things started to make sense, an awful, sick, demented sense that I never wanted to understand. I hadn't realized that I was being stalked for the last month. That weak-chinned creep didn't even go to the school. That's why he showed up in the middle of the year and nobody knew who he was, and why he couldn't get into the dorm without following somebody in. All those notes he took were probably about my routine and may also be about the routines of other girls too, but I couldn't understand why. Was it because I said he was ugly? Could that be what sent him into a month-long obsession? I reported him right away, but the school's response wasn't that helpful. They said if I ever had a problem with it again, I should report it to the police. However, I guess that sick freak got bored of me in my college, because he was never seen again. My guess is, he was using us as targets to practice on. In all fairness, this experience has taught me to be more aware of my surroundings and more wary of danger.